Hello, and welcome to the Transport Leaders podcast, where two transport experts discuss various things in the transport space. I'm Russell King. I'm a transport policy and transport strategist expert. I've been involved in transport for the last 20 years, and these days I write the Transport Leader blog and newsletter.
And g'day, I'm McCabe. I'm a transport planner and traffic engineer with 30 years in the industry and worked primarily in the Asia Pacific. Okay, Russell, what are we going to talk about today?
Light rail, Graham. Today it's about light rail. Or is it trams? Which is a good place to start. Are we talking about light rail or trams, or are they the same thing?
Okay, or even very light rail, like in Coventry. So light rail's a term that's kind of been invented to separate what the Americans call streetcars from something that's not a metro or heavy rail. So the definition primarily comes around just the vehicle mass and the length, and that it operates on the surface, often in its own guideway, but sometimes you'll have street running sections. So it is a tram in the technical sense of a rail vehicle that runs on the street. But these days they're very much more than that. So they're very typically separated from cars and given priority.
Now, given that we're talking about light rail that used to be known as trams commonly, these things date back a long time, well over 100 years, I think. Did you know when trams started going?
Horse-drawn trams date back to the early 1800s.
Wow. So we're talking a couple of 100 years now.
So you started off with horse-drawn ones, then into steam, then into electrical-based systems. And for the antis, we're not going to talk about trackless trams today, which are a very good form of bus, but they are still a bus vehicle. So we're just going to stick to the thing that has steel wheel and steel rail, like in my background.
Okay, so we're not going to talk about it, but you're going to pan it anyway.
No, I'm not panning them. I actually think they're very good. They have a place. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Everything has a place. So we've talked about this whenever we talked about public transport. Streetcars have a place. Light rail has a place. Bus rapid transit, including different vehicle types, such as trackless trams, have metros, heavy rail, commuter rail, intercity rail, all have their place. And if anyone tells you that one is the perfect solution, they don't know what they're talking about.
Okay. So yeah. We'll talk about when light rail's the right solution then in a bit.
Yeah.
But let's carry on with the history. Yeah. So trams became quite ubiquitous in many developed countries, cities at the turn of the 19th century, right? So this is prior to the mass adoption of the motor car, right? These are doing a lot of, not the heavy lifting, but they are doing a significant proportion of movement within our cities. Is that fair?
Yeah, so within the CBD areas, where streetcars were the best way to move lots of people as population got beyond what you could move in an omnibus, a horse-drawn vehicle. And they also helped deliver the first suburbs away from railway. So particularly in the USA, Canada, a lot of streetcars were developed by property developers in order to create garden suburbs so people can get away from the dirty, smoggy, rat-infested urban environments.
And my understanding is that the city of Los Angeles, of all places, had one of the most extensive streetcar networks of any city in the world. At the sort of the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, and even then it had sections of what you would consider light rail. So underground dedicated routes for the streetcar vehicles, exclusive right-of-ways, and yeah, unfortunately the motor car got in the way of that being kept. And there's lots and lots of histories about the trolley car conspiracies, about how the automotive and oil companies basically formed cartels in order to destroy tramway systems.
Are they therefore conspiracies? Because they're pretty well evidenced these days, aren't they? I mean, people like Peter Norton, the historian, has done quite a bit of work in this space. So they're not really conspiracies in the sense of conspiracy suggests that, maybe a conspiracy and just truth.
Sorry, there was a proven conspiracy.
Yes.
Which has documentary evidence. So conspiracy in the old, I suppose, legalistic sense rather than conspiracy theory.
Yes.
Yeah.
They conspired to do something to the tram systems, successfully.
Yeah.
And that's well evidenced, yes.
Yeah.
As opposed to today, conspiracy theories thinking, which is you're talking, poorly evidenced thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. So then we have, Europe kept a lot of its tramways, but you have countries like France where they were also ripped out, and France really started leading the way in the 90s with the introduction of what we would call light rail. So early 1980s, they started building dedicated routes either on former railway lines or through street running sections with your more modern type of tram vehicles. So low floor, dedicated stops at ground level, priority through signals.
Yeah. So after ripping them out in many places, most of Australia as well, we've started to put them back in about 40 years ago, and they've just sort of gained momentum there as a solution. So you touched on earlier about light rail has its place, in sort of being the right solution. So what are the characteristics then? When is light rail the right solution as opposed to a bus, heavy rail, trolley bus?
Yeah. So, a trolley bus is just an electric bus that is attached to a couple of electricity wires. So you can have trolley buses which are BRT, and you can have trolley buses which are just regular buses. So again, that's a vehicle type. So light rail is a good on and off vehicle. So having changeover of passengers, because you have lots of doors, you want it integrated into the urban environment, unless you're right in the middle of the CBD. And some parts of the world, they do put them underground, particularly if there's a very large number of light rail vehicles going through CBD. Brussels, for example, uses what they call pre-metro, which is light rail vehicles, but they're running through a tunnel, which has been designed that should demand warrant conversion over to proper metro, that it's all ready to go. Seattle, they built a bus tunnel, which was designed to be converted to a light rail tunnel. So light rail vehicles, you're in the low tens of thousands of people per hour, and you're trying to get the people to change over. So because you don't have many seats, you have lots of standing room, lots of doors. There are parts of North America where they've probably taken it to extreme, where rather than building a light metro, they're using light rail vehicles. So Seattle, Ottawa, Calgary, Dallas, there's lots of places where they're using light rail vehicles where you may be preferring in the long term to do a light metro.
And what's the reason they're doing that? Is it cost reasons, as in it's significantly cheaper?
It's cheaper when you have lower demand. So your large light rail systems in North America are primarily in places that are still very car dependent. So northern Toronto, they've just opened, in the northern suburbs of Toronto, they've just opened 2 light rail routes, but they are still in very, very car dependent areas, and they don't have the population density around where the stops are to build a full metro line. And its cost per kilometre is significantly lower than a metro, because a metro you have to fully grade it.
So why in their scenario was this the right solution as opposed to a bus?
Well, one of them, actually many of them, they were buses. So in a dedicated bus lane, you run out of capacity, even if you have absolute priority, at about 160 buses per hour. You cannot run more vehicles than that. Kiribati, which is probably the world's best known BRT system, where they've got bi-articulated buses with high door boarding, prepayment before you hop on the vehicle. They're actually now going to move to a metro because the buses have hit capacity on their first bus corridor. So you just run out of room and space. So light rail vehicles you can have, because you're using the steel wheel or steel track, you have a much more stable vehicle. So you can have a lot more people standing rather than sitting. So if you look at a modern light rail vehicle as opposed to a 19th century streetcar, there's a lot fewer. So historical trams will have a lot of seating and a small standing capacity, whereas light rail vehicles have a much higher standing capacity than seating capacity.
Okay, so a key factor here is about capacity. What about a scenario, because one of the things about light rail here is, you touched on it, is the urban amenity, right? Whereas a light rail seems to at least not take away from the urban environment and the placemaking capabilities, if positively adds to it, possibly. That's not true of a bus.
Yeah.
And, okay, even buses are becoming cleaner, less diesel, more electric, etc. But they're still not as good as a light rail in terms of the urban placemaking. So does it make sense for a light rail to have a light rail where you're trying to do a big placemaking project as well as considering the capacity?
Yeah. So typical light rail vehicle, 300 person capacity. So if you're running one of them every 2 minutes, your theoretical capacity is about 9,000 people, per hour along that. And then you get much longer ones. So now, we've got 70 meter, vehicles, which are running through city streets. So you think about moving 9,000 people with electric buses. And if your capacity is 110 people, that's 90 buses versus 30 light rail vehicles per hour. So even if you give the buses signal priority, you're still got a bus every 45 seconds rather than a light rail vehicle every 2 minutes. So you can see if you're trying to create a space where you want lots of people walking and wandering across the street or whatever, or sitting outdoors and having a coffee, then just the pure amenity feeling of being able to see across the street. So you can people watch while you're having your coffee, or you can be looking at the side of a vehicle.
Yeah. So that's at one end, buses to light rail in terms of capacity. But you've also talked about, places that are going from buses to metros. They're skipping the light rail step, presumably because of the demand piece. So in that scenario, do you just get rid of all the buses completely? So do you just free up that space for other things like, it's just walking and cycling? Is that the right then answer, or is there a place for light rail or a bus that, because it can stop more frequently than a metro?
Well, metro stop spacing, you can go as low as your customers will tolerate. Same with anything,
Yes.
So in work that I've done, the shortest spacing between bus stops that I've seen on the same route is 90 meters.
Yeah.
This dates from the days where you could literally ring up a bus company and say, I would like a bus stop out the front of my house. Now it's very much the opposite. People ring up bus companies and say, I don't want that effing bus stop out the front of my house. In Melbourne, there are suburban commuter rail stations which are 600 meters from platform end to platform. So, basically the distance that you would put a modern light rail stop.
So you should just basically have an exit at either end, and the journey should just be one end of the platform going to the other end of the platform, pretty much.
Yes. Yeah, you could, hop on. Well, actually, in the time it takes for you to get between the stations, you wouldn't actually be able to walk all the way through the train. So, so your stop spacing is efficiency design thing. So how long does it take you to open the doors? to slow down and stop? How long does it take people to get on and off the vehicle? So you can trade frequency versus door capacity versus stop spacing for the same number of people per kilometre.
Yeah.
So if your demand per kilometre of route is X, then those three things combined will tell you what your speed and demand will be.
Okay, so we have a bit of a weird situation in Sydney, and I'm interested in your perspective, and I might declare an interest in that. I was involved in the business case for both of these projects and the feasibility work for both these projects, which is we have a new metro called Metro West being built, which goes from, broadly speaking, Sydney CBD to the middle of the city, which is the geographic middle of the city, which is Parramatta. And we have, along part of that route, we are building a new light rail line as well, which is Parramatta Light Rail Stage 2, I think it is, which basically goes from Sydney Olympic Park into the Parramatta CBD. So, but it's going to run parallel to the new metro line. So does that make sense? Or are we duplicating capacity? What's the score here?
So, well, in the global context, that metro line is not a metro line. It's what you would call an express metro.
Because of the lack of stops, effectively.
Because of the lack of stops. So you look at somewhere like Seoul in South Korea, where you have express metro, which runs along the same corridor as a local metro. New York does this as well. They have express lines on the same path as local trains, whereas the Western Sydney Metro is not a true metro in the sense of the words. It's a automated commuter rail train.
Yeah.
So aside from that, the light rail is running along a slightly different corridor where it has more frequent stops, which are designed to bring about property development and increases in population and density.
Yes. So it's playing a very
serving
different role.
Different function. Yeah. And there's another factor, which is the access time. So, you know, the deeper you go with your metro, so very few modern metros are built like New York or Paris or London, where, you know, you're doing cut and cover and the station platforms are just below the surface. The platforms tend to be deep, and you'll have a, you know, access time of, you know, 5+ minutes to get down to the platforms. So if you're going a short distance where you've got a long access time to get down to the platforms, well, then having a surface, you still want to have a surface vehicle of some sort, because that actually takes you directly to the places that you want to go. Okay. So you want your metros to be high capacity fast, where the access penalty is worth the time saving, and your light rail vehicle to be slow and where time's not as important, either because you're not traveling a long distance or you have high frequency at the surface. Yeah. All right. So you are doing lots of research around how to make things better. Why do you think light rail's the fashion at the moment?
I think there's a number of factors in here. So the first factor is the workhorses of our public transport system, the ones that move the vast majority of people in public transport, are buses, and they are largely unloved by the public.
I would go to say, in good parts, hated.
Yeah. And so as a consequence of that, politicians announcing new buses, new bus routes, bus lanes is in many parts actually a vote loser, not a vote winner. So that puts politicians off promising buses. But for those that are publicly transport inclined, they still want to have a solution, but the bus might not be the politically acceptable one. And so what you then do is, I think you're in danger of, we talked about this with high-speed rail, is you kind of go, it's a nice, shiny solution, therefore I'll advocate for that. And because it's nice and shiny, the public like it. And I think that's where light rail can fall nicely in. It can be very good for winning over public support because they've seen light rail in places and have seen how it has good urban amenity benefits as well as the mobility and transport benefits that it brings. It's more comfortable than a bus. It's cleaner than a bus. It's not, all the diesel fumes that you have with most buses. It's quieter, safer. So I think all of those factors incline politicians to choose it as a solution, even if from a technical perspective, we would assess it as not the right solution because it's significantly more expensive. And our prices of light rail vary greatly, and we'll talk about that later. But it is significantly more expensive, even in places where it's done really, really affordably. But it's much more popular with politicians. So I think what we've seen is as we've had a trend towards more placemaking, buses are still largely unloved. Light rail can win political votes. And we've seen that, I saw that. I worked on 3 light rail projects in New South Wales. I would say 1 loved, 1 unloved, and 1 in between to begin with.
Just by working out which order you're talking about.
I kept it deliberately vague to see what you think. Which one do you think was the unloved one?
I would say Newcastle.
Yeah. So Newcastle light rail, I think it's a bit wrong to say it's a bit unloved. I think it divided opinion. I think would be a better strike. There were people who vehemently hated the idea of light rail, and there were people who vehemently supported it. And so I think it was probably more divisive than unloved. I think that would be fair to say. And then, which one do you think was the one in the middle?
That would be Parramatta.
No, I would have said
because City Southeast had lots of issues around Anzac Parade.
There was the issues around Anzac Parade, which was around a large chunk of moving mature, beautiful trees in order to make space for the light rail. But it was also, I think it was controversial at the time as well when we were closing George Street to construct the light rail. So Parramatta, on the other hand, I think politically was a win. I think Parramatta saw it as a significant investment in the city and part of its renaissance and development and regeneration of the city centre and the surrounding area. So I think from a Parramatta perspective, I think it was a political win, and I think that will be proven over time as well. I think it will be sustained as a big success.
Yeah, and then you have the other direction where what were heavy rail lines get downgraded into light rail lines, but they do change things. So Port Melbourne, so the line from Melbourne to Port Melbourne and Melbourne to St Kilda were previously heavy rail lines. Massive opposition to them being closed down as part of the South Bank redevelopment. So the 2 heavy railway lines went through a disused industrial area that was proposed to be redeveloped, and in order to help facilitate that and a casino, the railway lines were removed where they crossed the Yarra River and converted over to line. But there is, I think, more development out along the corridor. Though pretty sure they didn't actually increase the number of stops along the way, but they did make it more interconnected. The tram lines, the light rail lines actually have street running sections on either side of the former railway lines. And that's been done in parts of the world where there is no longer demand or feasibility for heavy rail maintenance, but there is enough for a higher order mode than just buses. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's really interesting because the people who are in my profession who are very pro buses tend not to listen to the community who don't like the jerkiness of the way buses operate. And we've talked about this before, the mass of the bus, how the tyre, static and moving friction makes for a more jerky ride, and you can overcome that with technology, which the trackless trams do very, very well. But there's also the rock and roll of buses side to side on the road, and then also how the drivers drive them. There's a lot of bus drivers seem to drive them like they're driving a heavy truck, which is going to get penalised and miss his next delivery run if he doesn't get to the end of the route on time. So if we had an attitude of the driver's being rewarded more for providing a comfortable ride than being on time. Maybe people would like buses a little bit more. And you still have all the same problems with electric buses. Electric buses get rid of the noise and the local air pollution problem. They don't get rid of the ride quality problem.
Yeah.
That buses have.
Yeah, I think all of those factors make light rail a much easier political sell and a much easier, populist, if you like, solution to a city.
So why do people oppose light rail then?
So I think there's a number of factors in here. One is expensive projects, right? So people see that as taxpayers' money, and if they're somebody who is a committed driver, not a public transport user, and would never dream of using public transport, they'll go, well, why are you spending my money in order to pay for transport? Why aren't you upgrading the roads instead? So I think there's part of that challenge. I think you've also got light rail. In order to make it work, you need to give it priority. The journey time needs to be reasonable, and because it's on the street surface in many instances, you're effectively saying, are you prioritizing the light rail over motor vehicles? And so I think there's often an objection to people for prioritizing light rail over motor vehicles. I think that's another challenge. I think the third one I would say is businesses along the light rail route can be pulled in two directions, I think it's fair to say, with regards to light rail. So after a light rail is constructed, often the urban environment is improved, footfall increases significantly. So businesses along the route of a light rail often benefit significantly their business after construction. But during construction, it's really problematic for those organizations. And so they could go through, if your construction is extended for various reasons, and we'll talk about some of the problems you get with light rail, if that construction period is extended, reduces footfall, reduces your customer base, reduces your income as a business, you can see why they would not want to go through that pain for an extended period of time. So I think all of those factors would contribute. Then you kind of got localized issues, which might be, as we talked about at Anzac Parade, there were trees that needed to be removed for light rail. So removing trees is always removing mature trees is always a sensitive thing to do these days, and those need to be taken into account. So sometimes you get local opposition into these things as well.
And because it's a very clearly defined path where there's going to be disruption for multiple years, makes it very easy to get, the community upset. So, if you're a dedicated anti-public transport person, then you can find one of those myriad of issues and go to all the people who live along the route or work or have businesses along the route and get them agitated.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges politically is light rail tends to go through phases in terms of political support. So when you set out your vision for the light rail, often you will get lots of support at that point. Then, although not always, Newcastle. Then Newcastle was a bit divided though, but there was a lot of angst about the vision on that one. Then when you start construction, that's when you get real grief, right? Because every problem that you get is amplified, and you're dealing with stakeholders who are genuinely suffering, as opposed to theoretical problems that you get in the vision piece. So politically, you need to sort of be willing to take on that pain of construction. And if you've done your project right, you've got the design right, and you've worked out the demand, and it's going to be busy, and it's and you've designed it well, then once you finish it, then you're all, it's great. Here's a great achievement. Most places, celebrate the fact that they have a light rail and it works really well, and people would never dream of digging them up again like they did in the 1950s and 60s. So, there is different cycles on politically. Now, the problem with this is you're then trying to align that with political cycles, right? So ideally, you kind of want to go to an election when the thing is popular, i.e., here's our amazing vision for a light rail. We're going to promise you this is going to bring amazing benefits and, regeneration and all sorts of other things. Okay. Then you want to construct the thing in the early term of your next government, hopefully if you've won the election. And then you want it up and running and feeling the benefits for a period of time before the next election, because the construction period is when you're going to be politically least popular with regards to the project.
Which is interesting, because you look at the way that they're built in the Anglosphere, and they do all the linear pieces first, and then they do the stabling and vehicles last. Whereas wouldn't your incentive to be to do stabling and vehicles early on, and then open out from there, so you can say, hey, we've got the vehicles on the track. Yeah, we're doing little test runs. You can come and see it coming.
I think you can tailor a project in light rail around election cycles about what you're doing and what you're not doing. So the thing I would say is, and we talked about this before, is you want to get your planning right. You want to do that sort of thinking slow, acting fast. And I think light rail is a really good example where that pays up in buckets politically as well as project wise. So you kind of want to go, let's get all the early work done, early investigations before there's and all of your design and your planning done really well when everyone's loving in the project before it actually starts construction. And then when you start construction, yes, if you want to start construction, if there's a benefit in terms of starting construction in areas where it's not going to be politically sensitive, get those done. But you don't want to be doing construction, in sensitive places in the middle of an election. That's just painful for political reasons.
Which is certainly what's happened in Queensland on the Gold Coast Light Rail, is that they were doing major construction works during an election campaign. They started testing the vehicles. This is on the latest extension after the election was over, and the incoming state government had overridden its own bureaucracy and gone against the wishes of Gold Coast City Council, which in Queensland local councils have a lot of power, to cancel the last stage of the light rail, even though it was already to go, basically.
Yeah. And as I say, I think, it's an example of where, if you don't get the politics of the project right, you risk, further investments and, people make political decisions in order to win elections, right? And so, and maintain popularity. So I think that's the challenge of getting the politics wrong on a light rail project. I mean, the other one that, going back to the planning piece, the pain that has been suffered in a number of locations. So Edinburgh had suffered this problem, Sydney suffered this problem, which was utilities under the ground, right, along the route. So
I worked on bits and pieces of the Sydney Light Rail, and dealing with the pre-tender phase. Yeah, and utilities was a major identified issue that the risk was pushed to the tenderers to deal with.
Yeah, and you can have a look at the audit office's review of the project, and that was something that was a mistake, and
because they weren't thinking slowly.
Yeah, I would argue they weren't thinking slowly. And they were, that part of the planning was rushed and not thought through. And there's kind of like, oh, how do we solve this? Oh, we'll dump it on them, and then that everything will be okay. And that was never realistic. It wasn't a risk that you could transfer in that way successfully. But it goes back to that. You want to understand in the planning phase, what is your challenges with utilities, and what do you need? What are your solutions on that, and how are you going to do it? Because otherwise, and that means, and one of the things about, both in Edinburgh and Sydney is these were historic corridors with unmapped utilities pits in them, right? There wasn't a map which goes, here's all your challenges with utilities. You just need to make sure you move these. You had to find the things first, and that wasn't always obvious and easy.
Which is interesting, because I recall in the lead up to the Olympics, the footpaths on George Street were widened, and a lot of utilities were relocated at that time. So
yes,
utilities map that was 15 years old was out of date.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here about why have we got our utilities well mapped and all those sorts of things. There's all sorts of stuff. I think I mean one of the things you end up with, and this goes back to different governance cultures, is who is responsible for moving the utilities bits. So typically in Edinburgh and Sydney's case, that was the responsibility of effectively the people who were building the light rail project. Whereas in France, that is the responsibility of the utility companies. And that has a significant impact on a project because in Sydney's case, the utilities and Edinburgh's case, the utilities both had an incentive to get as much bang for their buck from moving the utility.
Yeah.
So getting somebody else to pay for it and upgrading the pit, right? Because these pits are often the standards that they were done or built, they were the standards of 100 years ago. Whereas today's standards are completely different and they require much bigger pits and much more sophisticated equipment in the pits. And you can see why if you're a utility company, it's like, well, you have to build it to the new standards, which then significantly increases the costs.
Yes.
And of course, that's a cost shunt onto the transport, the construction, the project costs. Whereas in somewhere like France, you're moving the pits. You have to move the utility company has to move the pits. They decide what their pit looks like and how much money they're going to spend on it, but it's their cost. It's not the cost of the transport.
Yeah. And I do wonder how much of the issue actually relates to the standards that we're following and the legislative framework. So in Australia, light rail comes under the office of the National Rail Safety Regulator. So, which creates a standard which is very high, and that standard then flows through to everything associated with the project. When you're treating light rail and trams against, even if they have different physical standards, your performance framework is still one around that's, designed around, vehicles that are 20 tons per carriage rather than 20 tons in total.
So I think there's something about Australian asset standards generally. So just taking rail generally, I think we gold plate a lot of our assets. I don't think we make them fit for what we're looking for. And that massively adds costs to the costs of rail assets. Okay. And therefore, does that translate then into light rail as well and, produce asset standards that are not so appropriate for light rail? I would say yes, right? And so I think one of the reasons, and Australia is very expensive to build light rail, very expensive, right? And I think one of the reasons is our asset standards are not fit for purpose. They are gold plating the infrastructure, and compared to places in Europe.
I do wonder. We've talked about this, business cases and organizational governance. We don't have dedicated areas within government to these things. They are generally outsourced to the private sector. Whereas when you look at places where the cost is much lower, they have the in-house expertise and experience guiding the process. The detail is outsourced to the private sector, but you have people in the planning and delivery phases who are able to go, no, we can do this better, cheaper, simpler, because we have the experience from other projects. Whereas your project manager, there's 3 different project managers across, just in New South Wales, the project managers on these projects were different people and different.
Yes, and even within the government side of things, the government project directors were different people as well.
Oh, sorry, I was including them in that.
So the people at both sides were different. Okay, so there was not a lens of taking building capacity and capability. There was some aspects of learning from different projects, but I agree with you. There wasn't a focus enough on building that deep capability about what was the challenges. I also think that on things like asset standards, you don't want to be dealing with the asset standards problem when you're trying to build a light rail project, because that just delays it, right? That's going to delay your project, right? You really want to be dealing with that just as BAU. And I think one of the problems we have is, quite frankly, we're just not very good at managing assets in Australia, full stop. Okay. And As a consequence of that, the asset standards are not very good or not fit for purpose. And so what you end up with is very expensive projects because no individual project wants to have the fight on asset standards because it delays the projects and increases your costs, etc. So you just kind of accept them as they are on an individual project. And therefore, there's never a scenario where you're going, we're going to deal with the asset management, right? And it's never a priority because we don't manage our assets well, generally. That's not to say there's never improvements in the asset management, but I think our level of sophistication on asset standards and asset management, the maturity level is low.
Slightly tangentially, I used to work on transport interchanges, and one of the biggest problems that I had with bus rail interchanges was the people designing the interchange who were working for the state government would design bespoke pieces of equipment that they would then want to hand to a local council to maintain indefinitely. And the local council's invariable response was, we have a standard. Here's our suite of items. It's been published on our website for 5 years. You could have talked to us. We are not taking it.
Yeah. And actually, one of the big savings that they make in Europe that makes them be able to build projects like light rail much more cheaply is standardization. Standardization of the vehicles. So they just take them off the shelf as opposed to bespoking them. They take standardized stations or light rail stops, and they make it everything standardized. So they're not bespoking stuffs, which makes it a lot cheaper. They're not, the stations are being rolled out. They're exactly the same. So they're much easier to build, much easier to maintain. We didn't do any of that.
Because unique.
Yeah. It goes back to our, why do we need to test electric buses in an Australian environment, right? And we have all of these things where, we try to build everything from scratch and to an Australian standard, as opposed to saying just actually the other standards are more than adequate for our purpose, our needs. We can just use what they've got off the shelf.
Well, even worse, we do it differently between different. I mean, we're a population of 30 million, and we have 6 different standards for light rail vehicles, 6 different standards for buses, 6 different standards for
I'll
everything.
up you on that. I would argue that there's been different standards for light rail across different projects within the same state.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? So it's not even though, at least in the state, you're getting the economies of scale. No.
Yeah.
So, we have all of those sorts of challenges, which all add massive costs to the projects that we're building. So, there is a lot of work that needs to be done on just making Australia much more cost effective, but there's no work being done on that. That doesn't happen. Right? There's no project which goes, how do we make sure that all the projects we build are much more cost effective and dealing with all the problems that are inherent into how we operate? There's no work going on in that space. And that's one of the big failings, I think, in our sector.
Yeah. Well, and it's while we're talking primarily about Australia, it's not a uniquely Australian problem. It's an Anglosphere problem. It's Australia, the US, UK, Dublin had the same problems. Edinburgh had basically identical problems to Sydney, as you mentioned. And Sydney then went and didn't look at Edinburgh's delays and go, how can we do this better? They went and they just replicated it.
Yeah, I'm frustrated because it's one of the first questions. So I inherited the light rail project, working on the light rail project after it had gone through procurement to the PPP the partner had been appointed. And I remember, having come from the UK, I was well aware of the Edinburgh problems. And literally it was the first question that I asked, how good are we on the utilities? And I was told it was all fine.
Yeah. Well,
no, it wasn't.
And Edinburgh didn't learn from the problems that Dublin had encountered of reintroducing light rail.
Yeah. Right.
So
we're not, and to be honest with you though, it's something that we're just not good at, right? Is that we're not good at learning across jurisdictions. We tend to learn within a jurisdiction. So we don't learn the lessons even between Australian states, let alone on things international experience.
Well, yeah.
The only way we tend to do that is we try to, we often recruit people from overseas who have worked on similar projects and hope that they bring knowledge with it. But we're just not good at at strategically learning lessons. And I think this is not just in Australia. I think this is true across the world. We're not good at strategically learning from others' projects because it's all like, it's IP, we're protecting all this piece. So all of that IP often sits with the construction companies or, rather than where it needs to be, which is in the, the planning and design, organizations, which should be sitting within government agencies.
Yeah. And it's, one of those things that's, very frustrating is that there is no institutional knowledge anymore. Even within industries, there's this personal knowledge and experience.
Yeah,
if you don't get the right it doesn't matter if you get the best company, if you don't get the right person.
Yeah, and I think we're just, as an industry, we are not good at knowledge management across an industry. And when I say industry, I mean globally, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of this stuff is people working globally. And as you say, it's very much in people's heads as opposed to this knowledge being available as a resource base, which will, I think, significantly improve all of our projects and significantly reduce costs and improve delivery and all sorts of things. And we're just not doing enough of that at all.
Yeah. So how do we fix it?
Well,
listen to all our other episodes about how things can be fixed.
Well, yeah,
they all apply.
I mean, one of the things I'm doing at the moment is I'm doing a lot of work through my transport reform network that I've started. And, one of the things that will come up at some point will be some people who are like, we need to fix the asset management stuff. We need to fix how we share knowledge across projects, right? And so one of the things I'm hoping is that when I work through it on the reform network group, we'll look at how we can fix those things and the solutions that can deliver it. And maybe we do need to create an independent resource base where that information is freely available for people to use and that pulls in lessons from around the world in order on these projects.
Yeah. So, which is interesting because there are things like the National Transit Cooperative Research Program from the US. Europe has a similar body which publishes in multiple languages. But I think the gap is the translation of the research and the best practice into what's being applied within government organisations and the consulting and construction industries. Because, these days, a lot of people within the consulting industry do not have time to keep up to date on what the latest research is in their areas of expertise, and the industry bodies aren't doing a very good job of informing people of what the latest research is. A lot of that activity is very much promotional.
Yeah, but one of the things when we talked about this in our AI episode, was that this is an opportunity that, AI can help us with in kind of going, what's the latest research in this space that we should be aware of? So that when you're doing that, planning, design, etc., you can take into account the latest research very easily because it's all built within an AI system. So I think one of the things though you've got to do is you've got to make sure that the resources are there for the AI then to absorb in the way that we need it. So I think that AI, I think this is an area where AI can help a lot moving forward.
As long as that does that fact checking, which they still haven't solved.
Yeah, and we're still going out that curve. I still think it's a lot more. We moved us a lot further forward. The trick is making sure that you don't, overly rely on it as the gospel because it does have a tendency to hallucinate.
Lawyers have found out when they've tried to use it in cases.
As big four companies have found out when they've used it for producing reports and have come a cropper in the infrastructure space.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good spot to leave it. Yeah, AI can help you, but don't treat it as gospel. And certainly don't let it design your light rail alignment for you. Do proper public transport planning before you start scoping out the alignment.
Very good advice there from the transport planner. Thank you very much, Graham. As always, it was really good to talk to you.
Thank you, Russell. And as always, please comment, like, subscribe, share. And if you want to help us make this a better podcast, feel free to throw us a donation on one of the platforms. And we will see you next week. Thanks, Russell.
Thanks, Graham.